Sylvia Mbataru is the East Africa researcher at CIVICUS. She joins us now to talk about the report. Thank you so much for speaking to us. Do you believe that this excessive force to clamp down on protests is an attempt to suppress dissent in the run-up to the election?
Thank you so much for having me. Yes, definitely. So Kenya, over the last couple of years since the ruling party took over government, we've seen a whole lot of suppression of protests. And especially now as we run up into the elections, this has continued with the police using a lot of lethal force to disperse protests. And a lot of times they use live ammunition and or crowd control mechanisms such as using of tear gas and batons to threaten protesters and also just to clamp down on dissent. So basically, yes, it's intended to clamp down on dissent, especially critics against government.
Let's take the recent demonstrations, the protests against the rising cost of foods that you mentioned in the report, the Njaya Revolution protests. You say they've been met with unlawful arrest, detention and brutal force. Can you give us examples of what happened and what reasons were given by law enforcement officials?
Yes, so the Njaya Revolution protests were met with a lot of pushback from authorities. And a good example is in the one that was held in the city of Mombasa, which is in the coastal region of the country, where we had police forces dispersing protesters, using batons to scare them and to basically disrupt the protests. We've also seen in these protests where when the protesters go to the authorities ahead of the protest to give them the proper notice as is required by law. We've seen situations where the police are actually rejecting these notification letters, even tearing them up in a bid to basically declare or kind of declare them as illegal. So kind of to prevent these protests. And we've seen that also in Nairobi, where we've seen protesters getting arrested and even getting prosecuted in court. So a lot of these protests have been met with a lot of pushback from authorities, both in Nairobi and also in Mombasa.
And the presence of crowd control weapons, which you say are lethal, which obviously are like live ammunition, but there's also a tear gas and rubber bullets that are also used by the police at these gatherings. In South Africa, there's been a great deal of conversations around the laws governing of that, but most importantly, the police's understanding of the laws. Can you give us Kenya's context with regards to this?
Yes, definitely. So systematically, the authorities' response to protest has been the use of either lethal force or using crowd control mechanisms. So we've seen a lot of cases where we have protesters and sometimes even bystanders getting shot dead because of the use of live ammunition. In terms of crowd control, we have the use of tear gas, water cannons, which is very, very common to disperse protests. So this has been the systematic response by authorities, has been actually to use some kind of weapon to declare, to disrupt. Basically, the intention is to disrupt protests. So there has been, it's very systematic. It's been there for since before, the colonial period, because the law governing some of these things, including protests, the Public Order Act, are laws that came into force even before independence. They came during the British colonial rule. And despite the fact that we have a new constitution that guarantees the right to peaceful assembly, we find that these old laws are still being used by authorities. So the main response by authorities has actually been the use of this kind of weapons.
And how have the laws that you've mentioned been misused in terms of the protests themselves to undermine peaceful protests? As you've said, you talk about the Public Order Act, a law from the British colonial periods. And this is part of the problem, isn't it? The inability of the law to evolve with the democratic times, the transitions.
Yes, definitely. So the Public Order Act requires that protesters, for example, provide notice to the police 3 days ahead of a planned protest. And this was back again before the colonial, during the colonial period. But you find that in 2010, we got a new constitution that guarantees the right to peaceful assembly. And yet we have these old laws that has already been overridden by the constitution, still being relied upon by authorities. So what we see in our documentation at CIVICUS is, first of all, we have the police requiring that you notify, which is in the old law. But what the old law does not expect the police to do is to treat that notification as a right to grant permission by the police. So you're expected to notify, yes, but it's not required to be interpreted by the police as discretion upon them to provide permission for you to protest. But what we see is that the police here in Kenya construe this law to mean that they have the discretion to either deny or provide permission. So a lot of times you find that what they do is they exercise their quote-unquote discretion to deny permission. And when they deny the permission, then the protest, according to them, is considered to be unpermittable. So what happens in a context of a protest where permission was denied by the police, then these kind of protests get very likely that they're going to be, disrupted by the police because they say, oh, we did not provide permission. But the truth is the law as it is does not require the police to provide permission. They only require the police, the protesters to provide notification. And the reason for this notification actually is to enable the police to be able to facilitate the protest, to provide protection. And for example, if there's things like, traffic management that is required, then this notification ought to be something that allows the police to be able to facilitate the protest and not to disrupt it, not to construe it as, a discretion to provide permission or not. But we see that, according to our documentation, it's been interpreted by police as giving them the right to, give or deny permission, which is completely against, the law, how it's written.
Sylvia, I wonder if you can comment also, particularly in terms of campaigning and vulnerable groups. We understand that female candidates vying for office have faced undue attack, both physically, violently, but also in terms of the ability to campaign in areas by law enforcement officials. Are you able to comment on that?
I would be able to just lightly comment on that. So what we see is the issue of women aspirants in the country, to be honest, in terms of campaigning, they have always, over the years, received a lot of challenges, to say the least. It's been an ongoing issue even in previous regimes, even in the current regimes. We've always found women aspirants finding it especially difficult to campaign. And we have definitely seen that also. It's not a new thing, to be honest, and it's quite a sad state of affairs. But women aspirants tend to face definitely a more difficult environment in terms of campaigning, which tends to also give them a very unfair disadvantage against their counterparts.
Thank you so much for speaking to us. Very much appreciated. Sylvia Mbataru, she is the East Africa researcher at CIVICUS.